Hello, I'm Bruce DuPuy. Coming up today on News Talk, 24 million people watched the first GOP debate, a sure sign that voters have real interest in the 2016 campaign. But are debates the best way to determine which candidate would make the best president? Our first guest says no. Lee Drutman is senior fellow in the political reform program at New America. Then, for decades, White Flint Mall was synonymous with luxury. But today, it's a wreck, half torn down, and the subject of a lawsuit between deep-pocketed antagonists. We'll get the latest from Washington Post business reporter Jonathan O'Connell.
From News Channel 8, this is News Talk with Bruce DuPuy.
We welcome you into Studio B on a Monday. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Glad you could join us because we have a great lineup for you today. We'll get to our main topics in a moment, but first, paying tribute to a civil rights legend. Julian Bond died over the weekend. Bond was a civil rights pioneer. He founded the Southern Poverty Law Center in 1971, and he was instrumental in the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. He also served in the Georgia House of Representatives after he was finally allowed to be seated to that post. D.C. Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton knew Bond well, and she joins us now. Delegate Norton, thank you very much for your time this time. You worked alongside Julian Bond in the civil rights world. Tell us about the man you knew.
The man I first knew in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee called SNCC. When Julian was one of the founders of SNCC, I was a member of SNCC, but Julian was its spokesman, one of its chief strategists and tacticians. Julian was one of those SNCC members that never left the movement. He lived his whole life in the movement and on the cusp of other movements. He understood movements move on, and he moved on with them. He became one of its most celebrated spokesmen throughout his life, and we in Washington, of course, revere Julian Bond, because Julian Bond had lived in Washington for 30 years and joined our movement for voting rights and for statehood.
Yes.
You may recall that if you got into a taxi in Washington a few years ago, you were greeted by the image and voice, and that voice became one of the most familiar voices in America, of Julian Bond saying, "Welcome to Washington, where we don't have the same rights as those of you sitting here."
What skills did he bring? What particular, in terms of his voice, his great looks, his manner, can you describe some of the things that made him a force in the movement?
Well, great intelligence, an ability to focus, a real wordsmith, an ability to conceptualize what we were doing and why it was important, and great accessibility to all parts of the movement. Just within the last few months, Julian came to an intergenerational conversation that I had during Black History Month. Julian and I talking to Howard University students who had been active in Ferguson and in New York City with the police shootings, after the police shootings. And Julian spoke both from the movement that he and I knew, but he spoke to the movement of these young people. And one of the most memorable moments in that conversation was how he recounted that he dropped out of Morehouse College, but then warned the students, do not drop out of college, because Julian Bond was of today, and today we're not advising students to drop out of high school or college for any reason.
There's a tendency, perhaps for some, to think of the civil rights era and the push for social justice generally as being from a time that is past. But surely, for those who are paying attention and for those who are living today in certain communities in particular, we know that the civil rights era is now, and the push for social justice continues.
Well, one of the things that Julian and I discussed with the black students is how, for all of its achievement, the civil rights movement of which we were a part never touched racial profiling, and that has become the civil rights issue of today. Today, we are trying now to reenact, on its 50th anniversary, the Voting Rights Act. That should tell you everything about progress and about what happens to progress. In this case, it was the Supreme Court that turned us back, and we are still in the fight of our life to get the Voting Rights Act back. Julian was active, of course, throughout his life in the movement for African American rights, but he was in the LGBTQ movement. He was arrested in Washington for climate change. You know, he was on the cusp of the great movements of his time.
Even after he was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives, his white colleagues didn't want to seat him. How did he appear to be not bitter in the wake of all of the personal and professional slights that people of his era absorbed and experienced?
Well, let me tell you two ways. One, when he was not seated because he said he was against the Vietnam War and all war. I happen to be a constitutional lawyer at the ACLU and wrote the amicus brief that case ultimately became a landmark case, a First Amendment case, because Julian was expressing his First Amendment. In that way, I feel that Julian has always been with me, because no matter where I've been in my life, he's my constituent, he's my colleague in SNCC. And just 3 years ago, I invited Julian and John Lewis to sit with me in a conversation, again during Black History Month, to discuss the movement. And this was a very interesting conversation because Julian and John ran against each other for the seat John now holds in the Congress. And one of the most gratifying things to see was the two of them sitting and speaking as colleagues without the slightest trace of bitterness. And that was a very bitterly fought political fight that John finally won. It tells you everything about the spirit of nonviolence and reconciliation that characterizes the life of John Lewis, and that certainly characterized Julian Bond.
Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, good to speak with you as always. Thank you very much for your time today. We didn't want today's show to pass without paying tribute to one of the leaders, to one of the greats in the U.S. Civil rights movement and community, the late Julian Bond. Thank you for
thank you for that.
Thank you for helping us today. We turn now to the 2016 campaign. The first GOP presidential debate on Fox drew, as you know, an extraordinary turnout, an estimated 24 million viewers. And given voter interest in the race for the White House, we can expect future debates to also score in the ratings. But are debates the best way to determine who would make the best president? Lee Drutman is senior fellow in the political reform program at New America. He joins us now. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be with you, Bruce.
It's exciting to have people tuned in, plugged in, watching debates when we have them. And although we're still early in the process, we're still over a year from the general election, and the primaries and caucuses aren't for several more months. It's great that so many people are watching. But talk about why debates come up short in terms of what this exercise should be about, picking the best president.
Well, let me ask you, what are we talking about now after the debates? Are we talking about policy, or are we talking about whether Donald Trump made an inappropriate comment about Megyn Kelly? Right. So debates encourage us to think about the sound bites and not really about the substance of what it means to be president. What it means to be president is to make tough decisions, not rely on prepared sound bites that you can get across in 1 minute before that bell dings.
And let's pick up on this notion of making tough decisions, because arguably that's as high, that aspect of the job is as important as any that a president encounters. You know, setting priorities, choosing staff, yes, those
Sure.
are right there too. But you don't pick the agenda. You don't pick the topic. You don't pick the timing of events that come. And when you're president, how you deal with issues. Barack Obama has said before that if a decision can be made down the food chain, down the chart, if you will, from the President of the United States, well, it gets made there.
Right.
It's the ones that are really tough, really sticky, that get kicked up until they're on the desk in the Oval Office. That's what we're looking for, right? A crisis leader and a decision maker.
Right. That's exactly right. That's what leadership is. It's the ability to make hard decisions when the answer is not clear, and that means the ability to ask good questions. Right. It's very easy to come into a debate and have your quips ready to go and to rattle off something in 1 minute. Right. That's, people can rehearse that, but when you get into the role of being president and things get thrown at you that you don't expect, and you might not know exactly how to handle it, but you have to be able to figure out how to reason through those decisions, right? You have to figure out how to ask people around you good questions, not necessarily that you come in and know, I know exactly how I'm going to handle this, because life throws up surprises. And what I want to know, and who I'm electing as president, I think most people should, is who can work through those difficult situations and not get flustered, not panic, but really think through things. And so what I've suggested is that, look, I mean, I don't even think that we should call these things debates, right? They're group interview sessions is what they are.
And the punditry and our individual assessments as viewers and talking with friends, or family members that we watch the debate with, or people we see at the office the next day, our judgments are often, not exclusively, because a lot of times we are thinking about the substance and we're trying to determine which candidates have views most aligned with their own, but a lot of times we are grading the theatrical, the ability to respond in the moment with a zinger, a quip, a comeback, or if you're someone like Rick Perry and you get caught flat-footed, that can be the meme, if you will, that sort of dominates discussion going forward. What those skills have in common with being president, I think that's a tough argument to make.
Yeah, I don't know what those skills. Look, I think it's important to know where presidents stand, and part of being a president is being a rhetorical leader, but that comes through in the campaign, right? They give a lot of speeches. They get questioned on their positions over and over again. What doesn't come through in the campaign is how they would work through a crisis situation. And that's why I think rather than having these debates, or maybe in addition, we should put these presidents through some crisis simulations. A lot of companies do this in selecting executives. A lot of employers do this, right? You want to know how a person responds to tough situations when they're on the spot, when they don't have the zinger ready to go, because that is what it means to be president, really. And I think people don't understand that. I think part of this would be an education for a lot of people to understand what it actually involves being president. It's not just getting up there and dashing off zingers and telling people why they're idiots or why they're losers, right? It's working through a situation.
Talking with political reform advocate Lee Drutman of New America. We'll take a quick break here. Back with more News Talk right after this.